Here it is. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why we do this. I think the first thing to say is that one of the core convictions of the Christian theological tradition is that God is not a thing or a being that we can figure out. God is not a thing that you can figure out. It is crucial for all of us to understand and to remember that God will always and forever only exceed our understanding. God is more mysterious. God is of such a different category than us that there's no way to draw an accurate map of God. There's no way for us to say, you know what, we've been at this a while and I think I've cracked the code. I get it now. There is always going to be aspects of God, complexities, scales of goodness that remain beyond our comprehension. But it's also a crucial aspect of theology that we can know something about God. We can know something. Folks like Augustine and Aquinas, the big hitters of the Christian theological tradition, we'll talk about how you can know some really important things. God has told us some really important things. God's also created you to be a smart and capable, rational individual where you can work some stuff out. But you're very much just scratching the surface of what's there. And yet, the process of trying to figure some of those things out they're good for us relationally. And it is appropriate that we would call this a forum or a kind of formation, because they should form the way that we're living. And we should shape the type of person that we're becoming before each other and before God. And in this sense, wrestling with the mysteries of God, with the mysteries of the story that we've been given, where a perfectly satisfied and good God creates a world and then enters into it and dies and then comes back to life and is continually upholding the created entity, trying to wrestle with that and its mystery is good for us. It's one of the ways that we grow in our understanding of God. It's also one of the ways that we can express and grow in our love of God. I've been married for almost a decade, and I'm still figuring things out about Meg that are like wildly hilarious and new and strange. And one of the best things I can give to her, one of the best things we can do in a relationship is to spend time with one another, right? If you love a thing, you want to spend time getting to know it and enjoying it. And in that sense, theological investigation, or reading scriptures or praying, thinking about God is an act of love. And it's good for us to try and grow in our understanding of God in that sense. I think it's also a helpful practice for us as a community, as a church community, for us to try and tease out the implications of how this story should impact our lives. If Fleming Rutledge is right, then the way that we read the crucifixion and like the various metaphors and motifs that the Bible gives us about that story, that should be the core story that we form our lives around. In a very real way, it should impact how I go home after this. It should impact how we receive Eucharist in a little while. It should impact the way that we're praying for our leaders in our community. It should impact how we tip our waiters when we go out to lunch. But there's no area of our life that shouldn't be wrapped up around the central crucifixion, the central story of the crucifixion. And so it's good for us as a group as we're trying to figure out what does it mean to be a faithful Episcopal church in Chattanooga, 2021. How do we minister to the needs of this place, and how do we be faithful to the stories of God? It's a good exercise for us to work that stuff out together from the foundation of our own narrative. So that's my take on why this is good. I think it should be both enjoyable and educational. It should also be formative. And if we do it right in the spirit of prayer and humility, then I think it can help us sharpen our love of God a little bit as we, even if it's just us kind of bumping against the mysteries of the thing, that's probably a helpful exercise. Questions or comments on any of that? Concerns? Okay, I'm going to keep going. I hope you feel free to interrupt me. I'm not going to be worried. So let's look at the central question. The central question. Historical consensus says that there was, in fact, a Jewish man that went by the name of Jesus in the first century. There's a lot of historical data to support that. The most critical religious historians, that's not at all what they're contesting. There's broad consensus that there was a dude named Jesus, and that he was executed by the Roman state by way of crucifixion, which was not an anomaly of how you would put someone to death. It was a state-sanctioned form of execution. And this figure, Jesus, was killed in that manner. And yet, there are contested claims about that person. So Christian theology recognizes that the event is at least partially salvific, meaning that our salvation and our status before God has something to do with this death, whatever happens in it. I say partially because different people think it happens in different ways. Is it the crucifixion alone? Is it the crucifixion and the resurrection? Is it the crucifixion and the resurrection and the way that you live your life? How do those things fit together? At least partially we can say it's the crucifixion that is salvific. And in that sense, it does matter that Jesus dies, but it also matters that Jesus does not stay dead. Right? There's a period of days where Jesus is in the ground, in a grave, and then the story tells us that there's a period of time where he's no longer dead. It's good news. He's back alive, but not like before. He's got open wounds that people can touch. He's walking through the walls, but you can feel his body. Very wild stuff, the post-resurrection body. So nonetheless, Christians tend to claim that this part of the story of the death, which is what the book is going to take up, has some kind of salvific significance. And so the question that Fleming Rutledge is going to try and answer is what happens on the cross. In the last 200 years of theology, there's been a lot of different theories, a lot of different ways of rereading what's happening on the cross. And we're trying to specifically answer what unfolds when Jesus is killed, given who we claim Jesus to be. If the church councils and the creeds are right, and Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary and is a member of the Godhead, what does it mean that he dies? And has God been storing up the wrath owed to you and me up until that point? We've probably heard this version of the story before. God's just peeved at humanity for humanity's sins, and there has to be a scapegoat. And so it's an emptying of God's wrath. That's one interpretation. Does God simply unload God's anger on Jesus on the cross? Or is the capacity for sin, is evil itself somehow addressed in this death and this resurrection? And what does it mean for us to count this form of state execution as salvific? And if, I'm just layering the questions on because we've got 8 weeks here. But if you and I are going to say that we're somehow saved in this death, and I do believe that, if you and I are somehow saved in this, what is it that we're saved from? And how does the saving actually happen? And who all is saved? Fleming Rutledge is going to have some stuff to say about who all is saved. So this is just a good way, a good example for us to recognize that the ways that we narrate this death this crucifixion of this execution, it definitely impacts the rest of our theological system. If what's happening on the cross is that an angry God is finally like unloading the rage and killing something, that's going to impact the way we conceive of God. It's going to impact the way that we conceive of the pressures of our own sin. If it's that God is raging against injustice and evil and suffering, and is dealing with those things in the cross, that's going to impact the way that we understand theological ethics or the life of a Christian, the stuff that we should be concerned with. If it's that God becomes so familiar with our own experiences as being a human, and to the extent that he will undergo suffering and death just to be near to us, that idea of proximity will impact the way that we move throughout the day, knowing that there's no longer foreign experiences that you have that God could not possibly understand, right? That would go out the window too. So from the very beginning, Rutledge is trying to say the way we tell this story matters, right? We need to be pretty intentional with it because it's going to have some big ramifications for everything else. Questions or comments on that? Does the central question make some sense to you? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll do a big picture take of like what's going to happen in the book. Some of Rutledge's a little slice of her main thesis, and we'll look at the structure of the book, and then we'll talk about the first chapter. So I'm on the big picture section on page 2. Fleming Rutledge's book is confessional, which is, when I use that term, I just mean she is talking about belief claims. She believes things about the crucifixion, and the book is written from that position. And it is a pastoral text. You can get, if you read any theology, I imagine you will feel something of a different tone here, because this is written from a pastoral figure. These aren't abstract ideas for her. This is like written over the course of a decade in between sermons and pastoral counseling. So she thinks that there's stuff in this narrative that can impact the lives of people. And it's aimed at moving the crucifixion back to the center of our theologies and our worship. And in her mind, it's a resource for lay readers and preachers and anybody and everybody who has an ongoing interest in making sense of Christianity. And Rutledge says that the cross is the very heart and center of our faith. I'm already going to apologize for the countless typos that you're going to see in here. So whenever you come across one, just please forgive me in advance. The cross, she says, is the very heart and the center of our faith, from which all other elements find their meaning and coherency. I think that is the main thesis, that the heart of the thing is the crucifixion, and to make sense of any other theological idea or any other aspect of the gospel narrative of the Christian tradition, it only makes sense in relation to the crucifixion. Otherwise, she says, it's misconstrued or it becomes a kind of an empty plaything. So she's going to develop a pretty thick 500-page, 8-week-long theology of the cross, and she's going to weave together what I think is a novel tapestry of biblical, pastoral, and patristic insights. Father Brad and I were interested in this book because it's a pretty recent development in Episcopal theology, but it's got a great mix of biblical stuff, a great mix of historical theology stuff, and a great mix of pastoral concerns and takes. It's all of that in one. In the first part of the book, she is going to explore what she calls the scandalon of the cross. And she's going to try and illuminate the ways that that scandal is so central to the Christian narrative. And it does matter for her that it's scandalous. It does matter for her that it's like a specifically tortuous kind of death, which we'll dig into next week, I believe. In part 2 of the text, she's going to unpack the biblical and the patristic. Patristic is just a term for talking about early church fathers and mothers, early theologians. She'll unpack the biblical and patristic theology of the cross by examining a series of 8 overlapping, mutually dependent motifs. So each chapter in part 2 is a different motif or a different theme of the cross that will show up in early theology and will be scattered throughout the biblical narrative. And part 2, she's going to try and layer all of these. And she's going to try to weave them all together and say, in order to really get the crucifixion, you got to have this kind of interlocking tapestry where it's all these different motifs holding each other up. And she thinks we have a tendency, us like in a church and theologians in general, have a tendency to fixate on just one of those pieces of cloth, one of those threads. And we'll obsess over it at the expense of all of the other elements. She's going to want to hold all 8 of them together and say it is a heavy blanket, but it is enough to keep you warm. Let's see. All in all, she's going to argue that in order to properly perceive the nature and the function of the cross, we have to reckon with its godlessness, the way that God is absent from this event. We have to reckon with the way that it is God's expression of justice and the way that it definitively overthrows sin. For Fleming Rutledge, it is a final reckoning with sin. It's not like maybe we've started this process and we'll work out the rest of it later. It's like the final period into the manuscript kind of address, which I take to be good news. Once we do that reckoning, she says, we have to move the cross back to the heart of our theologies. I do think that Fleming Rutledge's, I'll say this one more thing and then I'll open it up for some questions. Fleming Rutledge's take on the cross being kind of moved to the periphery of theology, I do think she's right about that. There have been criticisms and concerns with the way we talk about the cross in the last 40 years, maybe. And people are to get away from like, what do we do? What do we do with this violent story? What do we do with some of the angry images of God that it gives us? Out of some of those anxieties, people will rephrase it and kind of stick it to the side. And there's been like a shift in focus to things like creation or the resurrection, or embodiment, or the ethics that come out of the cross. And sometimes that's for good reason, I think, and sometimes that's because people are squeamish about it or don't know what to do with the interpretations that we've been given, or what do you do with the implications. So Fleming Rutledge, looking at that kind of context, is going to say, no, this is front and center. And we have to figure out now how to make sense of the anxieties that people have been responding to. And that's why she's going to want the big 8 interlocking motifs. So to really make the case that we can have this front and center in our theology and we need it. That's why we get the 600 pages. Any questions about the big picture? Comments?
Does she think of it that there is something that it's moved to where the cross was at the center? Does she?
I think she looks at theology in the last 40 years and sees the way the cross has been moved out. It's been replaced by talk about the resurrection. It's been replaced by talk about creation. It's been replaced by talk about ethics. And not that it was ever fully cut out, but it's definitely been put on the shelf in a sense. And that's what she's going after. Yeah.
We know what the background is prior to being priest or prior to looking into it. Like, was she raised Episcopal?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to repeat the question too for the Zoomers. So Brad's question was about, does she feel like the cross has been taken out of the centrality? And then would you tell me your name? Christina is asking about, if I heard you correctly, Fluent Rutledge's background, like what's going on prior to her experiences in Greece in writing this. Brad, you're gonna know more about this than I, would you mind sharing a little bit about her background?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Just very quickly, I actually was a seminarian at Grace Church Broadway, where she spent a long time on staff, and has been a priest, my goodness, I bet for 40 plus years. And came out of the evangelical tradition. The Episcopal, Grace Episcopal Church in New York City on Broadway is very, those of us who are from the South would feel very comfortable when we walk in there. It has sort of this Southern flavor to it. And for quite a while, it actually had a number of rectors who were from the South. And so it has that flavor to it. In that evangelical tradition, in the sense that we really own the evangelical tradition in the Episcopal Church. So the cross, it does make sense that this would be a real focus for her. She's also had several major life incidences like we all had, one of which was being hit by a car. I think it might have been a taxi, but I'm not sure, in New York City. And she writes in that about a number of places, preached about it, written about it, having her face down on the pavement, sort of coming to understanding of God's presence and pain and loss and that sort of thing. So mostly, I think, out of that evangelical tradition that she comes out of, is probably the biggest impact. She's a very harsh critic too, for seminary and preachers. So.
That's a terrifying task to preach. Thank you, Brad. Other questions or comments? Okay, well, we're doing okay on time. Let's look through the centrality of the crucifixion. This is the chapter 1. This is a pretty easy one to get through, and then we can review a little bit, and I've got some questions, and we'll pause at 10:10. All right, so in the first chapter, Rutledge is arguing that the cross is at the very heart and center of Christianity. The very heart and the center. And everything else stems from and finds its meaning in relation to this apocalyptic event. And we're going to hear plenty about what she means when she says apocalyptic. We'll talk about that a good bit. But everything finds its meaning in relation to the crucifixion. So if you get it wrong, you're going to get a lot of the other stuff wrong. And if you sideline it, then you're going to misconstrue a lot of the other stuff. And for Rutledge, this is painfully obvious in the Gospels, even in the structure that the Gospels come to us as or in. So this is a quote from page 41. She writes, "Where all the evangelists agree is in the massive attention they give to the passion narrative and the way they aim their Gospels toward the cross as the climax to the story of Jesus." All 4 Gospels do this. That in terms of the amount of time and deeds that are carried out in Jesus' time of ministry, John even tells us, like, books could be forever written on all of the things that we've seen, but we just get a small snippet of what's actually carried out. Proportionally, we get there's really long takes on the passion narrative, right? It's sort of a flyby with miracles. There's healing, cut holes in ceilings. It's wild. He's out in the desert, and then like a long buildup towards the crucifixion. We get everything like slows way down structurally. And we get the trial, we get the night before, we get the context and the marching to the city, we get his friends betraying him, they're in the garden, nobody can stay awake. There's Peter cuts a dude's ear off. Like proportionally, everything leads up to the crucifixion. And it is given, it's like the climax of all 4 of these gospel texts. And that is what she means is that the Passion of Christ serves as the denouement of each gospel, a bit of the narrative through which everything that precedes that portion receives its meaning. She thinks all of the ministry, all of the healing, all of the questions and confusing parables, all of the stuff in the wilderness. Everything is, it's almost forward-looking to this kind of clarifying resolve of the text. This is what it's been leading to, she thinks. And she also believes that that's true for what comes after the crucifixion as well, particularly the resurrection. The resurrection and its meaning we can only perceive what the resurrection means and entails when we fully understand what's going on in the crucifixion. It's not just anybody's coming back to life. It's not just Jesus coming back to life from, like, this resurrection is different than Lazarus's. It's different than when Jesus heals the Roman centurion's kid. It's different precisely because of who it is and because of the kind of death. After she builds that out, she articulates the way in which a rich theology of the cross challenges Gnosticism. Everybody hates Gnosticism. And she takes Gnosticism to be the root of all man-made religion, all human-made religion, I should say. She thinks false religion and empty religion, at its core, it is really just a kind of Gnosticism that has been around for a long, long time. And when she's talking about Gnosticism, I think she means four things. So one is an emphasis on spiritual knowledge. There's an overemphasis on spiritual knowledge. Historically, the Gnostics believed that there is a secret salvific knowledge that only a few people had. You couldn't really talk about it too much, because then the secret would get out. And you wanted the community to grow and grow, but before people could get a share of that secret knowledge, they had to really buy into the cult of the thing. So this spiritual secret knowledge that is given to just a few people, at the root of Gnosticism, she says that the crucifixion and Jesus' suffering in the world is like the best challenge to that kind of private spiritual knowledge that we have. Gnosticism is also a hierarchy of spiritual accomplishment. It's like people are put in a hierarchical relation. The more amazing spiritual stuff you've done, the better off you're going to be, and the more private, the larger share, I guess, of your spiritual knowledge you would have. Gnosticism would typically devalue material life. If the spiritual knowledge from another world is the only thing that matters, then to a certain degree, your body in this life would just be holding you back. And if, as the Gnostics would believe, this private spiritual knowledge is the thing that can save you, then it's less about being faithful in the world, living ethically in accordance with Jesus' teachings and ministry. And it's more about just getting through this life for the sake of the spiritual one on the other side. Those are historically related to Gnostic religious practices, but Fleming Rutledge is saying those tendencies are all over the church today. Like, we find those popping up all over in core forms of religion. Avoidance of ethics, a devaluing of our material life. We get really obsessed with ideas apart from spiritual ideas, apart from actually living them out. And she says all of those bad religious tendencies that have been with us for a long time, and it's no accident she thinks that they're still around. The crucifixion is addressing all of that stuff, knocking all of that off of the table and saying that it's very much illegitimate. And after she goes through the Gnosticism stuff, she spends a decent amount of time on that. Then she explains that she's hesitant to let the incarnation and or the resurrection overshadow the central import and the place of the crucifixion. And she does think that the last 30 years of theology have done that. I did mention the incarnation earlier when I was talking about that, but that becomes one of the things that people focus on instead of the crucifixion. So one of the ways that the crucifixion is kind of pushed to the side is people get real fascinated with and think, yeah, the crucifixion happens. But what's even more important than that is the strange union that we have between God and humanity. in Jesus. Like it's one person, two natures, we would historically say, that's what the creeds tell us, fully God, fully human, bound up in one person. And the last 30 years of theology in response to all kinds of social and cultural issues, all kinds of like reckoning with the theological tradition, it has been a kind of a push the crucifixion area to the side. We've talked about that plenty. Let's really focus on the incarnation and the resurrection. And Tony Rettel is trying to bring that back front and center. Against those trends of prioritizing other theological takes or positions or categories, she views the cross and the resurrection as a singular event, particularly as it's articulated and experienced in the Triduum. This is an important point, I think. And it will be easy to overlook this, given how much she talks about the crucifixion. But when she says crucifixion, she does mean crucifixion plus resurrection. Everything from like passion to the ladies are at the tomb and it's empty and it's good news. All of that is bound up in crucifixion fulfilling Revelation. And then on page 71, she concludes the chapter with what I think is a pretty helpful little summary. She says the crucifixion is the touchstone of Christian authenticity, the unique feature by which everything else, including the resurrection, is given its significance. Everything else is given its significance from the crucifixion. And if she's right about that, then there is plenty of reason for us to spend another 450 pages, excuse me, trying to figure out why is it so central? What does it mean? And what should we think and feel about it? What questions do you have about that centrality bit and how she's trying to move it back front and center? It's the main piece that gives everything else its meaning. Questions or concerns or comments? Yes.
Did she ever mention anything about the fact that the Catholic Church pictures the cross with Jesus on it?
Yes, she will. I want to say it might even be in the introduction.
Repeat the question.
Say again?
Repeat.
Oh, perfect. The question, thank you. The question was, does she ever mention anything about Catholic imagery or iconography with the cross featuring Jesus still on it? The cover of the book, she talks, I don't remember if it's in the afterwards or the introduction, but it's a stained glass window from,
Wales.
It's been a while since from Wales? Okay, perfect. And there's some tie-in to the Baptist church bombing in Birmingham as well, which I can't exactly, do you remember the connections there?
The Welch gave that window
To the Baptist
to
church.
that Baptist church after those 4 girls were.
Okay, that's right. So during the civil rights movement, there's the bombing of the Baptist church in Birmingham. Those 4 little girls are murdered. And then there's a Welsh gift, which is the stained glass window to that church, and it's still there. And she reflects a good bit at one point about the imagery of it and the fact that Jesus is present on the cross. She deals with a little bit, but I can't remember the specific takeaways of her treatment of it. So that's just a long-winded way of saying it is a point of concern. Do you remember some of her commentary?
It's in the very first part.
Okay.
The book is very compliment. The first thing that it explains that window, and there's something written on the bottom. I can't remember that.
Given by the people of Wales.
It's kind of in the same glass.
Oh, you do it to me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So would you tell me your name?
Shannon.
Shannon, thank you so much for helping me with that, Shannon. Shannon's saying there's a really helpful overview of the cover and that story and her like analysis of it on the very like opening pages of the book for whoever's interested. Yeah. Good. Yes, sir.
My name is Mike, and
Hi, Mike.
hi.
Probably not gonna articulate this very well, but this matter of the cross having been central in the past and then been pushed away a bit. I'm thinking from the perspective of somebody who maybe has also pushed religion away or never really been involved in it. The idea of the cross being central, to me, it brings up sort of this is for somebody who hasn't, tried to follow the way for a while in Rome, but it brings up the thought of a very narrow theology. Jesus died for your sins, and that's why you need to be in church every Sunday.
Yep.
Have you been saved? Do you know Jesus? All that sort of stuff. And it that didn't communicate. I mean, that didn't say anything to me 20, 30 years ago.
Yep.
When I didn't know myself as well as I like to think I do now, for instance. So one of the things I've always enjoyed about the Episcopal Church, and by the way, that doesn't speak to me now.
Yeah.
At 61 years old. But one of the things I've loved about the Episcopal Church are the emphasis on the incarnation, and the emphasis on the connection between Jesus's life and social ethics. And to me, those are easier and more welcoming points of entry into the faith.
Yep.
Than what I'm calling a narrow theology, and I'm probably just saying that because I'm not a theologian. But that's my reaction to this. I think that pushing it aside a little bit is going to serve the gospel by bringing people into the church so they can grow and mature and understand why the cross should perhaps be.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Mike. So Mike's saying that an initial reaction is that the cross being the central thing is actually a narrow passage in it, and that there are ways of a narrow view of the cross where it is just have you ask God for forgiveness, and here's the way, like here's the single path by which it's done. And I think you're actually saying something that a lot of those theologians over the last 30 years have been saying, that we're really just hyper focusing on this one thing. And there's actually a lot of other ways in, a lot of other narratives or elements of the story. And when we play that singular narrow approach, we're actually skewing it each time, where it's become a kind of misrepresentation of the whole narrative of God and of God's pursuit of us. So they're looking in these other areas for some of the reasons that I hear you saying, Mike. And what I think, if Rutledge were here, what I presume she would say is, we want the cross to be center, but we don't want the narrow version of it. And if we can investigate the motifs properly, like give it due time, then I think she says you're actually going to get a richer version of the other things that are part and parcel of the same, I think. But we're going to have to see if it's compelling or not. Or maybe you don't find it that moving. And that's fine. Yes. Bill.
Is the crucifixion or Robertson's death and resurrection unique to Christianity, or are there ancient religions that also said this happened?
Yeah, great question. The question is whether or not the idea of crucifixion and resurrection is unique to Christianity, or if it's if we see this in other religious traditions. Especially resurrection, we see in other religious traditions, the motif or the narrative. I'm not as familiar with the idea of crucifixion. I think probably just because of like that form of execution being so local historically to the Roman Empire. But the motifs of a salvific figure or a prophet dying and then coming back to life is certainly not unique. Though religion would say this one is unique historically as a thing that genuinely happens with salvific and abortion. Is that a fair response? Okay, I have slightly mismanaged our time, so we didn't get to discussion questions, but I'm glad it's because we were already having a little bit of it. I do want to pause here so we can do some prayer requests with Father Bragg. But again, we've got 7 more weeks. I'm pumped to be here with you. Next week, we're going to do chapters 2 and 3. And we'll do the same format with Zoom and in person, and we'll have handouts then. Sound good? Awesome. Okay, great.
Vandy may not have an offensive line, but they sure have smart people. Vanderbilt, graduated. Zach could tell you they've got a PhD in theology, which I'm sure came through. And that's wonderful. What a great start. I've got 3 or 4 questions lined up. Since I'll be at something else, I think I may send it to you. But really awesome. We don't have a lot of time, but I really wanted to just to say that for those of you who have been online through the spring and early summer with our Rector's Forum, know that we checked in each week around prayer requests, how folks were doing, and it really became as deep a pastoral connection that I see as much so as we have also had in person. It was the most significant thing over the last year and a half, I think, for me personally. I know other people experienced online stuff that we did in different ways. And I share some of those ways and we may feel differently, but it was a really powerful thing. And I want to extend that not only for those who are choosing to be with us online, but also in person and maybe prime the pump a little bit for next week, just to say, if there are things that you want this community, this group here who are here today, and this parish community praying for you about, knowing about for you, highs, lows, anywhere in between, all of those things, we'll try and take time each week to offer that up. So for this week, I would say, because I do have to run, so we can start church on time, is to just say, be ready for that. We'll try to make that offer each week. And if you do have specific things, send them to my email. And if you don't have my email address right in your phone, go to our website or call us and let us know. And folks online can put those in the chat box. I think that is also recorded and are also my email addresses there. Okay. Zach, again, thank you. This is awesome. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.